project, and this is Snow Talk. This is the fourth iteration of it, where experts present and discuss research on topics related to snow, love, and the imaginary. And I'm so happy and pleased to have Sarah Perry here. I encountered Sarah's work through a talk that she gave, well, not the real talk, but the recording, at Refractor Camp in 2019, which was called, called How to See Voids. And I was like very taken by this concept of the imaginary void. And then I got to know some of her other writing through Ribbon Farm, where I'm not sure if you're still editing or.
Not usually, no, not really anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, she lives in Reno.
Thank you.
She made that beautiful weaving. And yeah, take it away.
Thank you so much. This is so fun. I love being able to give kind of a more like free talk. It's actually knitting, weirdly, but I'll talk about the shawl a little bit in my talk. Yeah, so I have like slides and stuff. Should I switch to my? It's mostly like beautiful pictures of mountains, so it'll be
amazing.
It's only a few walls of text. Okay, let me. Where is it? Share screen. I don't see the share screen button. Uh-oh.
Are you on a tablet?
Yeah, but I've done this many times and usually it's very easy to share the screen. Oh no.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like is it usually on the bottom of the screen?
I don't see anything on the bottom.
Alternatively, if you want to email me your presentation and I can also share it.
I can do that real fast. Hold on. That's so odd. Stuff just stops working.
I know, it's weird how that has happened today a few times.
All right, I'll email it to you.
Okay.
I sent it. Did that work?
Let's see. All right. And yes.
Yay. Awesome. Thank you.
Can I like present it so it doesn't look as funky? Like, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Just tell me when to advance
awesome.
the slide.
Okay, so this is just the title. You can go to the first one. So
okay.
This is, as you can see, this is not going to be a very academic presentation. This is mountain pose, also known as Tadasana. And this is one of the biggest improvements in my life, was practicing this pose. And I think coincidences are often good for talks, so this involves a coincidence. Basically, mountain pose, it's not a mountain, it's something you do with your body, is advanced standing. It's kind of, you can see this is Adrienne Mishler, who's one of the best yoga practitioners in America, I think. What it is understanding what standing is, and she has her feet spread apart. There's lots of variations. You can also have your feet really tightly together, but the basics of it is how to stand up straight, basically, so that your whole body is supported. And you can see she's making a very straight line. Her back isn't really curved either way. She's not hunched. And the thing she always talks about is having your weight distributed on the four corners of your feet. So each foot has four corners, and they're the two sides of your heel, and then the ball of your foot kind of underneath your big toe, and then the equivalent on the other side, the sort of knuckle bone underneath your little toe. And standing involves kind of positioning your weight across the four corners of your feet. So you're not kind of you're using your platform, the little platform that you have of your bipedal feet, to the best of their ability. My favorite variation of this that kind of helps you understand the four corners of your feet is to do it with raising your toes. So you have your feet flat on the ground, but then you bring your toes up so they're pointing up toward the sky. And this helps you kind of figure out how your weight's distributed. Like, if you can use your toes for balance, of course, but if you do it that way, you can see, is it distributed between, the two sides of the front, the two sides of the back, the front and back. And to me, I kind of had the insight that you do this because your toes are your foothills. So you're a mountain and you have these little foothills underneath you. And if you've ever gone up a mountain, if you look at a mountain from a distance, like from a valley, often the foothills look like they're about the same size as the mountain, like maybe they're about half as big. But if you go up a mountain, they're really tiny. Like they really do seem like the scale of the toes of a mountain. And I was trying to find pictures that illustrated this, but it doesn't come through in pictures. It's something that you can only get through going up the mountain and seeing, kind of comparing with your walking and the effort it takes, like how high you are. So you go up you don't go straight up a mountain typically. You go up a foothill and then you cross through a pass and then you go up another chunk and then you cross through somewhere else. And it's you get a sense, with more than just visually, you get a sense of the scale. And I love mountain pose because it's this experiential reminder of what it's like to be up there. That's hard to get just from pictures or from being in the valley, that you're this huge thing and these other things are just the size of your toes. And I think for me, at least, mountains are something that you go up and down. They're something that you experience with your body. So doing this pose is something that changes how you walk, I think, changes how you run. Having more awareness in your body from practicing standing. And it seems really silly, but this is my favorite pose. I promise I can do like more complicated poses, but this one's the most important one. I think I highly recommend her mountain pose foundations video. Okay, and yeah, I think mountains exist to the extent that they're experienced. And this is kind of a way of experiencing a mountain to me. Can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so here's the second way. This is number 2. So first is Tadasana. This is just kind of how painful it is to be in the mountains because they're so beautiful. And you encounter these views that even if you take pictures of them, it doesn't really get it across. Like this is about as well as I can do with photography, and it doesn't express it, like this little, especially over time, like the little orange line that comes up in the sky, the way the distant mountains, all of this scale, I think is kind of flattened in a photograph. At least my level of cell phone photography, it's not up to expressing the scale. And I think when you encounter these, at least when I encounter these beautiful scenes, and it makes me want to kind of bring that back. But since I'm not a good photographer, I've never painted. My only visual art ever is knitting that I'm any good at. So trying to kind of bring this back, I ended up really changing how I knit and how I work. And you can see in the next slide, you can see where I started out. If you flip forward. So this is like my first one. I was like, okay, I'm trying to bring something of the mountains back, and it's 3 solid colors basically, trying, oh, maybe this can be like the line of the dawn, and maybe this is like what it's like. But I don't think it brings much back from the mountains. And to me, knitting was limited to, well, you buy yarn basically, and then you put those colors together in this kind of geometric arrangement. And maybe you put, I made these laces that's supposed to be dragonflies and little flowers. And it's a little bit representational, but I don't think it really gets across what it's like to be in the mountains. But so if you look at the next slide, this is the big breakthrough that I had, that you don't just have to knit, you can like make the yarn. And you don't have to just make the yarn in one color, you can do it in any color. So, but the basic idea is that you can mix wool just like paint. Like you only, in painting, you just need a few colors, and then you mix every other color from those few colors. And it turns out that it's the same with wool, that you can dye a few colors. I tend to stick to traditional natural dyes because that's my chosen abstraction. I just like that. But then you can mix them into almost any color, and you can also have them either be so this is called a wool comb. That's how you blend wool colors together. You can either blend them several times and make them all a very constant homogeneous color, or you can just blend them a little bit and keep them really streaky. So on the right is what it looks like when I finished blending them, and then that gets spun into yarn, either on, usually for me, on a hand spindle. I have a spinning wheel, but I prefer the control of the hand spindle. And for the kind of thing I'm making now, you can go to the next slide. So these are realizing that I could just smush colors together and do anything I wanted. And there's one abstraction still here, that knitting is along some kind of a line, basically. And on the one on the left, it's a triangular shape that it's, so everything's kind of changing along this one sort of corner, this one line. And then the ones on the right, the top one's more along a curved space, but it's really only changing from top to bottom in one dimension, essentially. I put in some curves in there, and then the one on the bottom right is, slightly curved, slightly triangular, a little bit different shape. But what I was really curious about is, are you really limited to just going along one dimension? There's one piece of yarn or skein of yarn that you're using, and you start out at the top center, and then you go to the bottom, and you kind of build it up geometrically. Requires a little bit of math, but that's pretty easy. That's the easiest part. If you look at the next one, I did something really strange. It's also hanging behind me. This one is just, okay, so if you do something other than just changing it linearly, so it's something other than changing just top to bottom, this has different sections of different colors. And I don't necessarily think this is a wearable shawl that I would wear out, but it was kind of an experiment to see how representational can you get? What is that like? And so this is a view of Lake Tahoe. There's mountains in it, so it counts as a mountain thing. And with just really simple shapes, and all I'm doing is essentially doing top to bottom, but each line or each row doesn't have to necessarily be the same color. So I'm blending in always the same angle, except for the gray part is a different angle than the landscape part. And to me, it looks almost creepy. Like I wasn't expecting to be able to get that level of photorealism, and I think it's too much, but that was the transformation that the mountains kind of forced me to go through in order to express something about them. And it feels like I'm still a super beginner. I don't know anybody else who does this. I'm sure people do, because it's so obvious once you realize. But for me, at least for my independent discovery, although people probably have been doing this for hundreds of years somewhere, it was pretty exciting to me. So hopefully I can tone it down a bit and then just use this to have control over what colors go where and what it expresses. I also like this in some ways. I like it better than a photo because it expresses how big the space is, and it's kind of curved, you can see. So it's almost like what it's like to be there instead of a 2D image that you captured from the space around. Okay, so next one. This is the talk that Anna liked originally, that I thought I'd solved this great problem and I was totally wrong, I think. I mean, who knows? But David and I were hiking in the Sierras, and we saw these trees, and they had these beautiful, really regular rings of lichens called wolf lichen, I believe. And we're like, what's going on with that? We tried to come up with an explanation. We thought, maybe it's the snow. Maybe the snow goes up that high at different levels, and who knows, like it was so mysterious. And eventually I looked it up, and someone had the theory that it was woodpeckers, so that the woodpeckers kind of peck around in a circle and the lichen spores can more easily get into the pecked parts. And I felt like, oh, I solved it. This is the answer. And especially looking at pictures of the type of woodpecker we have, or at least one of the types of woodpecker we have here that's common, they do seem to peck in lines around the tree if they can get away with it. So I thought I'd solve the problem. I don't think I actually solved the problem. If you go to the next one, once I went in the woods with this in mind, I saw all kinds of things that disconfirm my hypothesis. You can see not all the trees have rings. And I was realizing if I wanted to actually know, I'd have to look at, the exact range of woodpeckers compared to the range of lichens, because these lichens don't show up everywhere in the mountains. They're only at high altitudes, but they're not always at high altitudes. There's plenty of mountains that have none. There's mountains where the trees are just hanging with them. If it was woodpeckers, you probably wouldn't expect it to be that thick on the branches, although it's not always that way. Although you can see the ring structure. So I think I gained some ignorance through this project. If you look at the last one, there's a close-up of a ring I found on a fallen tree. So you can see here, these are what I think these are woodpecker holes that are not at all on the lichen ring. So I don't know what to think about this, but I think it's not clear to me that it has a single solution. It seems like there's such an obvious phenomenon, these rings, that it must have an answer, but the tidy, nice answer I thought I found, I don't think actually explains it. So that is lichens. You can go to the next one. Fourth way to fail to understand mountains, rather, to get more ignorant about mountains, trees. And these are just pictures of city trees. The one on the left kind of shows how city trees are kind of nice and symmetrical. They generally grow straight up. They have like one trunk that goes straight up, and then they have branches that kind of go symmetrically around them. The one on the right is the exception that you see sometimes. This is a tree that's had its branches cut so it wouldn't interfere with the power line. So it's a tree that's pretty symmetrical, but made to be in sync and compatible with the city place that it's in. And I'm so glad they trimmed it instead of cutting it down. It's so beautiful. If you look at the next slide, that's not what mountain trees look like. Like when you go up a mountain, they're not these nice symmetrical things. It's more obvious on a mountain what a tree is. I think that they're, I like to use the word indexical, that they're so in their own context, that they're responding to these shortages, of water, of who knows what else. They're growing in all kinds of different patterns, and they don't look like a city tree, like a tree that's been maintained in that way and kept free of obstacles. And it made me think, like, what even is a tree? Like I had this conception as an abstraction of a tree, but they don't look like that in the mountains. There's a word, I think it's called Krummholz, German, for these kind of tortured looking high altitude trees. And I think they're solving more problems than the city trees, and they're also not having their problems solved for them like the city trees. They're not being planted in a particular order, which is great in the city, because one thing that's great is when the trees are planted in a line, essentially, or in some kind of along a path, then you get shade from them, and you want to use the path and be shaded instead of being in the sun. But that's not how they are out in the wild. They're a much different phenomenon. So if you go to the next slide, we're not at number 5. I just decided, well, trees, lichens, and then the birds, the woodpeckers, and probably everything else, they're kind of one thing. they're not just 3 separate things. You kind of have to consider them all together. And the hardest one is geology, that coming into contact with the Sierras, the question just like, how did this get here? What is this beautiful, huge rock formation? And geology is multiple things too. There's rocks, there's water, there's rocks that don't seem like rocks at all because they're thousands of feet under the ground and they're smushy. Possibly there's a giant space collision involved. I'll get to that. So you can go to the next slide. I don't think like I'd heard how mountains worked and how mountains were formed, but I don't think I really put it together until I cared about the Sierras and I wanted to understand them. So the picture on the left is the basic idea of how mountains are formed. Um, people weren't really sure about this until like late 20th century when plate tectonics kind of came into acceptance. But you can see this line. This is down toward Las Vegas. You can see this line of the strata of rocks, and it's kind of at an angle. So these rocks were laid down originally pretty flat, but what happens is when a plate smashes into another plate, there's not enough room, and there's all these kind of forces going on. So they have to create a fault. So the rock kind of, on one side it goes up and on the other side it goes down. And we're looking at the side that goes up. And they break in different ways. The Great Basin Mountains, the mountains that are just to the east of here, are kind of smaller versions of this usually, although some of them are 14,000 feet. But the Sierras, the big break is on the eastern side. So the eastern slope of the Sierras tends to be really steep, and then it just kind of gradually goes down toward the west. And well, what drives plate tectonics, what smashes the plates into each other with such force? I've used a figure from a geology paper that I think is great, a review paper. And the authors here are just showing us some of the cartoons that have been made of what this process might be like. And the idea is that convection, like moving around because of heat and pressure differences, is the huge force that powers the creation of mountains and the slamming together of tectonic plates. And I like that they give us 6 different pictures that people have made that are all really different from each other. And one thing that amazes me about geology, the jargon and terminology is hard to grasp, but the general mood of it seems to be, even though they have these really good measurement tools, they have all kinds of technology, they've had a breakthrough, they have, I think, a real science, they're really humble about it. The tone of the papers is always like, well, we don't know, it could be this, it could be that. And I really appreciate that compared to some of the social sciences. The cool thing here, so this is showing kind of cartoons of convection, like the stuff going on in the mantle, the smushy rock place, and even down toward the core. There are these weird little zones under the Pacific and under Africa, although there's a little one under North America too, under like from between here and Yellowstone, where like the measurements they have are really different. So if you go to the next slide there, they're called large low shear velocity provinces. So it has to do with how fast do radio waves go through the stuff, because that's what we can measure. We can't like drill a tunnel down into the smush and figure out what it's doing. This is a relatively new theory that I think is amazing, that the geology of the earth and at least some of this plate tectonic weirdness has to do with the giant Mars-sized thing that collided with us billions of years ago called Theia, that created the moon. And it's widely recognized, widely accepted that that's the case. I mean, I don't think people think it's 100% that the planet Theia collided with Earth and created the moon. This new theory says, well, maybe that's also what's stuck in the mantle core boundary, that there's giant chunks of this high density planet still stuck in the Earth, and that's part of what makes our geology so interesting. So I like geology papers. It's kind of worth getting as much of the jargon as you can, because it's very beautiful. I wish there were more introductory stuff. Like I've tried to get into introductory geology stuff, and it's like a fire hose of information. But I think it's a great science, and they have results, and it's real. So as far as mountains are concerned. All right, next slide. Okay, obligatory mention of snow. So one thing I think that's hard in our state, like we're used to liquid water, maybe we're used to ice in the freezer, but I think that phase changes in water are something that's almost unintuitive. Like you think of snow as snow, you think of water as water. We used to do like lateral thinking puzzles on hikes when I go on group hikes, and a great way to trick people is just to make up a lateral thinking puzzle with a water phase change, because nobody, it's like, is there melting? Like there's a famous one with the guy who gets stabbed with an icicle, and it's hard to make that transition mentally, that, oh, water phase change is a thing. But it's something that I don't think of in the mountains as much. I'm rarely up in the mountains when there's this much snow, and I wish I could see what it looked like when the water melted and when the snow melted. It has huge effects on things. The channels are always changing. Just because there's a stream on the map doesn't necessarily mean that's where it is, because in cities, water usually stays in the same place because it's kind of domesticated and it's in, maybe concrete that keeps it in the right place. But in the mountains, it's just wild. There's nobody keeping it in the same place. So the paths of streams can change a lot. I think it matters for the dispersal of some seeds. Being in a really high place seems like it's great for just raining down your genetic material on everybody else, and the flow of water probably helps with that. And sometimes when you go up in the mountains, it's really mysterious because there'll be this really high, like 20-foot high poles with the bright orange thing on the end, and you wonder what they are. And it's because the snow gets that high in the winter when you're generally not up there unless you're a skier. I think for me, at least, it's hard to keep in mind, and it's been a project that these places have go through major changes that you generally don't see unless you really mess up like I did. I came here too early, and it was really scary, but it was really fun. I got pretty snowblind even with my sunglasses, but it was worth it. Okay. Oh, and the other thing I think of that has to do with water is the time in the mountains. That we have this idea of seasons and things happen at particular times. We have snow where I live, and we have hot summers and spring and fall. Up in the mountains, everything seems a lot both slower and faster. Like spring doesn't really get going until much later. If you go up sometimes even in August, it'll just seem like spring, like everybody's kind of just starting and they have to get everything done in a very short period of time while it's warm enough. So it's a disconnected by altitude, but also disconnected by how cold it is because of the altitude and how fast or slow things go. So it's both faster because they have to get more done in a small amount of time, and slower because it's just later in time that they're even starting out. Okay, you can go to the next one. So here's the hardest one. The mountain is abstract down. Somebody just gave me the paper on the left I only saw for the first time a few hours ago, but I had to put it in here. The question they're asking is, do mountains exist? And you can kind of, thinking about it, of course mountains exist. Like I love mountains, of course they exist, but they're very hard to define. Among other things, they're kind of vague. If you look at a mountain on a map, you won't see like nice boundaries or anything. You'll see maybe the peak will be labeled, but what counts as the mountain? Do I live on the mountain? Do the foothills count as the mountain? And it reminds me of this other paper that I love called Why There Are No People, which is dealing with the abstract noun of people. And Peter Unger's hilarious argument is people don't exist. And he has a very, very tidy argument for this. And I think it comes down to the use of words, that there's a very effective use of words like mountain and people, which is to point to things in reality that are relevant. So, I point to the mountain, that's Mount Rose. There's people in this Zoom call. That's a fine way of using abstract nouns, I think. And I think mountain is an abstract noun, as this paper I think illustrates pretty well. The issue is when you try to take the abstract nouns as having some kind of ability to capture reality on their own, so that you can do things like do logic on them. I don't think people is a good noun for doing logic on, or saying, this is true of people at all times in all places. I think that rarely works out. Usually the correct statements are going to be probably about people near you, people you have experience with. And then any statement that's true, in general for all time is probably going to be either true by definition or like kind of trivially true, or just made up and fake. And that's probably the most common type. On the next page, I have just a little wall of text. This kind of goes into the vagueness or nebulosity of mountains. One distinction they made, I'll just skipping to the bottom. One distinction they make is that mountains are different from ghosts. Like they're both real in some sense, and in a similar sense that they affect people's behavior, at least in some way. That people talk about them, they motivate behavior. Their distinction they make is that mountains directly affect behavior, whereas things like ghosts and devils kind of indirectly affect behavior. I think there's something to that, but I don't think it resolves the question of like how real is generosity or love or depression or something like that. Maybe somewhere in between mountains and ghosts. They talk about mountains and as affordances, that generally there's not a high population on high mountains. Generally people live at certain distances from mountains. They don't usually live on really steep slopes, at least it's pretty rare. Something like a trail is an affordance to get where you're going. It gives you an ability, whereas cliffs, they call the cliffs are a falling off place where they're an affordance to kind of avoid them and not fall off them. So they clearly directly affect behavior, but they're still kind of a nebulous thing. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is, I don't know why it didn't have my title in here, but this is about generosity. So this is just one abstract noun that I think it's one of many abstract nouns that social science deals with poorly, but this is just as an example. This is an excerpt from a paper that was floating around Twitter to make me mad. And they say, the highlighted portion, the overwhelming majority of studies have reported that attractive people, both men and women, are less cooperative, less generous, less trusting, and less trustworthy. So all the claims in this are, we have this grasp on this thing called generosity, and we know a fact about it. We know that attractive people are less generous. I think it's really easy to believe that kind of stuff. And before I started really valuing ignorance, that was the kind of thing that I would just instantly attach on. Oh, this is science. This is real. Now we have a grasp on abstract nouns like generosity. Some of the failure modes I list to the left. For one thing, it's treating generosity as a general trait that people have versus like a mode that you can get into. That being generous all the time might not be such a good strategy or even valued. Like if you're so generous that you're a burden on those around you because you've given away all your money, and I think that might not be so good. As opposed to, do you help your friend move or something like that? Is it a mode you get into, or is it a state that you're in sometimes, or is it's just this easy thing that people have a generosity level from 1 to 10? I don't think that's the case. The other thing is how they're measuring it, and it's not clear from this, but they're measuring it in pretty contrived laboratory games or worse, surveys. And I think there's a major problem. Tal Yarkoni works on this, which I think his paper is amazing, on generalizability, that these kind of little laboratory games like that people play, well, that's how we really measure these abstract nouns. That if we put teenagers and college students on a computer and we have them play these games, then we'll know really the difference in generosity. They come up, another thing they do, they come up with an explanation for it. Well, the most likely explanation, and they're always coming up with stories, the most likely explanation is that attractive people expect favorable treatment from others because of their physical appearance, and therefore are less inclined to cooperate and more likely to exploit others. So I knew it was fake, but I didn't realize how fake it was. If you go to the next slide. This is the typical way that they're measuring generosity. This is one of the cited papers. This is an earlier 2005 paper from the same authors. This is one of the cited papers, but it's the same procedure. So they're in a public goods game on a computer. They have 20 tokens and they're investing in either a private good or a public good. So they have payoff matrices. And of course, I'm sure the teenagers completely understand this. And so the private good pays a certain amount, the public good pays a certain amount. And basically we say, if you contribute more to the public good, you're more generous. We're just gonna call generosity that. That's one problem. As I mentioned, another problem is average age is 20.3. These are kids. So whether we can generalize kids to people in general, especially kids, doing an experiment in this unusual environment. That's another problem. But it surprisingly gets worse if you look at the next slide. This is the 2005 version, and then their updated 2008 version that's cited. They're pretty small groups, like they're generalizing from 8 attractive people, allegedly attractive people from each sex, and the other one they have 15 women and 3 men because they're no longer trying to control for attractiveness by sex. But the really shocking thing is on the right, they don't actually get that result at all. This is how much they contributed. The attractive people contribute more, and it's not even statistically significant in almost every case. So it's cited for this result, but the result isn't even there. It is, so if the result was real, I don't think it would still be real, even if they found that. But this is just like, it's always worse than you expect. Every time I go down one of these roads, it's always faker than I expected it to be. So I think we can really become more ignorant and just not believing in these formalizations of abstract nouns. That once you get used to seeing one fake abstract noun formalization after another, you start to disbelieve them a little. And I think that's healthier than seeing them as essentially real. Just realizing how made up the stuff is versus interacting with people. I think if you're a human being who interacts with other human beings, you probably have more knowledge of generosity than you do than you get from social science. So I don't think it's true that attractive people in general are less generous, and I don't think that's the right question to be studying, and I don't think these are the right methods to be studying. Okay, you can go on to the next one. So here's one that has to do with mountains. You can see the nice snowy mountain again at the bottom on the left. This is the typical way I think that social science would grapple with mountains. Basically, again, they get a bunch of college students, and after a lecture, they show them some videos of places, including a mountain, and then they have them fill out a survey on how it makes them feel, just certain questions. And what they do with that is come up with a 5-factor structure. You can see it on the next page. These are the kind of questions that they ask. To me, at least, none of these questions go to how mountains make me feel pretty much at all, but these are derived from a previously existing 4-factor structure. They ended up pulling out a 5-factor structure. This is a really common procedure. I don't think we learn anything from this, but this happens to be almost identical to how, if you've heard of the big 5 factors of personality, it's almost identical to how that was developed. So things like giving people lists of questions, doing math on their answers to see which questions correlate with each other. Usually people answer very similar questions the same. Notice number 1 is, I'm in a different setting than usual. 3 is, I am in a different environment than usual. I can't believe those would correlate. Like, wow, that's such a good science. But this is shockingly common. And once you realize how much of psychology and social science in general is based on things like that, there's very little knowledge in the world that's real. I think most of it is going to end up being stuff like this, where I don't think we're actually learning anything from it. I don't think we learn about mountains from this, especially showing them videos in a classroom. That we wouldn't learn better by going up a mountain, or even just looking at a mountain for real. You can go to the next one. I think it's my last one. Yay! So this is the model for the shawl that I was showing for the main shawl, and just because it's beautiful, I don't think it captures it. You don't necessarily have the same feeling of space that you do when you're really there, but it's the shot to remember it by, just like the shawl is, and just like the mountain poses, that to connect the mountain, since we can't really live on the top of a mountain for the most part, to connect that experience to everyday life. I put my cute little motto here that words point. The right use for words is to point to things in the world when people are trying to accomplish things together. And the wrong way is to take a word as having some inherent meaning that that can translate between contexts, that's just obvious, and that we can learn about from survey responses. Did I go? That's pretty good. Okay, so that's my last slide. So we can go back to normal if you want.
Cool. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You have such an incredible way, like your methodology is like so good.
Thank you. This is being super loose and weird. So if this was able to communicate, that's a good sign. Thank you.
I think it's interesting. Yeah, I feel like there's something about it where it's like you really like lay the groundwork. So I feel like, yeah, it's good. You set the tone and then I feel like you blast off into like action and it's like okay because they're like those things there. Anyway.
Oh, my mom's here. Hi, Mom.
Oh, amazing. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just open it up for like questions. Like I definitely have questions, but yeah, please, anyone, just go for it. Unmute yourself, ask away.
Feel free to talk about your feelings about mountains.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any advice on how to appreciate mountain views. We have a friend who's like really, really gung-ho about climbing up to the top of mountains and like looking off of them. And like sometimes I'm kind of not as gung-ho as he is. And I'm kind of like, wow, yes, that's another beautiful view. But I feel like I'm missing something that he's getting out of it. And yeah, do you have thoughts on that or do you know what it is?
I think there's a million things that go into that, like how your body responds to altitude. I find altitude, like high altitude, really pleasant and really interesting, almost like a drug. Other people find it really unpleasant. And I think it either some interaction between altitude, brain, air thinness makes everything look different. So it's and since the photos can't capture it, I know I'm pretty sure it's something that's like not objective, but probably has to do with like, I don't know. I like a view more the more I get up to it, so I can see how it changes over time. But I think it's, it's a mental state like any other mental state. Some people like it more than others. And you might like some mountains more than others. Yeah, so it gets more exciting to me either when I'm hunting for something like particular lichens, or when I just like to see what they're up to, like how it changes from season to season and year to year. Like I think seeing it once, you have very little context. You don't know what's going on there, but seeing it several times, you start to see, oh, like that's so, like now I see how that works. And now I see why that's there. And that rock's in a different place and I can see why.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the observation that cartographers will label the name of the mountain in a place where it fit conveniently without like overlapping any other important feature of the map. Like they'll tuck it in the shadow. And I wonder if there is I wonder if we wind up with I guess thinking about how we label things and whether that takes up space in the actual, in the experiencing of it, versus if we're able to label things obsequiously. It's not really a question.
Like no, I love the line from the Do Mountains Exist paper where they say, if we went by maps, they don't have clear boundaries, so we'd have to say incorrectly that mountains don't exist. Like, yeah, I would love to learn more about cartography. I think it's really interesting. And I think it does affect like not just literal maps, but all the kinds of maps that we have that are partially in our heads or in a phone or there are a lot of things are maps, and I do think they affect our cognition.
Like working with agricultural data, there's this standard color set that's called altitude. That's like blue at the bottom and gray at, it goes through all the phases of green. and then it turns gray when it's mountains. But this gets applied to any altitude data set, whether or not it goes from. So I might be in a field that has a total of 12 feet of drop, but it looks like sea on the bottom, and sea in my grassy swale and mountain on my grassy knoll, and like, yeah.
That's how I feel about effect sizes. Like when they use different measures of effect sizes, I just get really confused. Like I know some pretty well and I have context for them, but when they're in some way that I don't have context for, it's like, wait, this means a different thing. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I like that observation. That is, what do these colors even mean? Like they mean something particular in the context you're used to when it goes all the way, but they're not as informative when it's smushed down, or they're informative in a different way, but you have to get used to that way.
You are realizing, no, I can still grow corn on this, even though it looks like the color of rock and lichen.
I have a question.
Okay.
That seems like a good follow-up maybe to that, which is, and it's probably more abstract. But I think I'm just like thinking so much about this idea of the abstract noun and thinking about the relationship between, I guess I'm curious to hear what you have to say about the relationship between basically being unable to like represent something. Like you keep saying how like these photos don't come close, right, to like the experience of being there. And I'm thinking about the relationship between that and an abstract noun. Like what's the relationship between representation and non-representation and an abstract noun? That's what
I think what they have in common is like there's always something more. And if you pull out a meaning for an abstract noun, whether it's through a survey or whether it's through a good way like conversation or something like that, there's always something more. And that's something they say in ethnomethodology, that what's his name, Garfinkel, I think, uses, that the something more is always going to be there. You're never going to have a complete understanding of it. You have maybe like shots of it. You have ways, and that's kind of what I tried to do with my like 5 ways of seeing a mountain. You'll never have a full understanding of it, but you can get closer to it. And I think things like experience and conversation and doing projects and trying to affect the world or something like that can get you closer to understanding. But I think surveys and most contrived lab experiments do not get you closer to understanding it. They give kind of the illusion of understanding it, and they make it seem like it's solved when it's really a huge mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Chicken. I kind of have a question about this. That this kind of abstract noun black pill, I feel like you have, right? Of like, oh, abstract nouns aren't quite pointing at things in the right way. But I guess I kind of dispute this idea of words as purely pointers. I feel like abstract nouns are actually meant to create arguments, right? Like we delineate a country's borders exactly because there's a conflict, and that gives us a name for the conflict, essentially, right? The border does. And so I'm wondering, is it really a problem? Because I feel like the contention is almost words are supposed to be photographs, but are they?
I like that. There's 2 things that immediately brings to mind. So I think the idea that abstract nouns are kind of to create an argument, I think that can be a real way of learning, even in real ways, like in conversation. I'm using the word generosity because I want you to help me move, or something like that. So I think that the studies are also arguments, and they usually have a particular point they want to make. And sometimes the numbers don't even work right to make the point, but they tell you the point anyway. Yeah, so I think conflict, it just because they're pointing, it doesn't mean that the pointing is cooperative. It can be, if you want to correct someone, that can be a valid way of pointing. If you want to, make your case, I think that's valid too. And yeah, that's how they work. I think that is an aspect of how they work.
And would you just agree that, in essence, like the kind of, in this language, the criticism you're making of, let's say, psychology studies is that essentially that there's no steady state to the conflict ending, right? That it can't end because of the.
Also, I think that, so geology has like rocks, and they can measure things. They can do like chemistry, and they can shoot radio waves into the earth and stuff, and measure earthquakes, stuff like that. Astronomy has hundreds of years of observations of stars. There's something out there that we can look at. I don't think psychology has anything like that. That there's no, like this, the word you use, steady state. Like there isn't necessarily a fact of the matter that is observable. And so people try to create a fact of the matter that's observable by doing studies. And I think usually it doesn't end up working that way. It's a false fact of the matter. It's a contrived fact of the matter that's not just looking at what's in the world the way that, you know, geology or chemistry or something like that is.
Totally.
I have a quick question, if that's all right.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what comes after the black pill. So, you know, obviously, even though these abstract nouns are super tough to get any traction on, things like generosity are also kind of what we care about in a major way.
Yeah,
and so
almost
we-
everything we care about is an abstract noun,
Right.
pretty much. Yeah.
And I know, like in philosophy, you know, they're trying these different ameliorative approaches of like conceptual engineering and experimental philosophy, where either they'll like really narrowly define something provisionally and just say, here we're gonna, you know, use this operational version of generosity, or they'll do like an experiment where they go out into the world and they ask a lot of people about case studies, and then they just try and take like, you know, native intuitive applications. As their rule. But do you have any thoughts on where to actually go to get some traction on these questions and be able to use abstract nouns to think?
My feeling is you get that by talking to people and trying to do things with people, or alone. I don't know how it's going to work out in psychology. I don't, like, it's totally possible they'll come up with methods for having some kind of grasp on a real ground. I'm not super optimistic about it, but I think you can get knowledge about important things just from the world. I think you know, conversation with 5 people about something is probably more informative than a study. So actually this is really important. With the study, I think, so if I have conversations with 5 people and I want to report that, the issue is, do you trust me? Do you trust my my ability to synthesize information? Do you trust me not to lie, among other things? I think with studies that gets elided, is that the way you say it? that gets skipped over, that we don't think about, well, do I trust all these steps that they went through? Because it's labeled as science, whereas I think we should distrust that just as much. To me, if someone I trust and have a lot of context with says something, then that I can get a lot of information for that. But someone I have no context with who's done a study, less so. And I think it's the science of it is almost a dream that you could ignore the issue of trust. And that's something I think is really important, that I don't think you can ever get past that. I don't think we're going to get past having to trust people for what they say. And having to interact and trust people and be wrong and be betrayed and fail in order to understand about that. Thank you.
I'd love to ask a follow-up to that question. So, like, look, okay, so your beef with surveys, right? Is it like, well, how do you know that they're telling the truth? They could be lying to you, right? They could have this attitude of like, you know, am I being detained? And there are many circumstances in which you should suspect that of survey takers, like when you take a survey for a corporate workplace, right? The last thing you should assume is that the purpose of either giving the survey or to respond to the survey is like the dispassionate search for the truth, right? However, there's like an entire you know, branch, if you could call it, game theory of economics, that's concerned with like designing games in which people have the right incentive to do the right thing. So you can think of this as like inverse game theory, right? You're not starting forward from the game and working out what the equilibrium is. You're starting from the desired equilibrium and asking, what is the game that would support this equilibrium? And in the case of survey, right, this takes the form of information elicitation, right? Like, how do I design a game such that people have the right incentives to tell the truth? And in some cases, you can accomplish that, and it's like really interesting when it works out. A lot of auction theories like this, and even when you don't actually have the right the formal game theoretic incentive to tell the truth, it's sort of remarkable actually, like that we get like anywhere near the truth at all, right? So like you take this survey and say like, look at this instrument, right? It's complete trash. But the worse the instrument is, the more impressive the result is in the end. That your 5-factor personality model will correlate with occupation or whatever outcome, right? So like, so I guess my questions are, this is a question, I promise, not a comment.
That's fine.
One, are you interested, like, are you interested in the promise, I guess, of mechanism design? And secondly, shouldn't these partial successes, despite the extreme methodological inadequacy, be actually all the more impressive because of that inadequacy?
So I think honesty is one aspect. I think it's a very small part of the problem. The bigger problem is that either the questions aren't capable of having a single meaning, even though they're treated that way, but we don't know how people interpret them. Almost any question on the Big Five inventory, a lot of people could answer in a lot of different ways, depending on their feeling about the words in the question. And I think what surveys tend to be measuring is like patterns of language use, rather than being connected to the underlying trait that they're pretending to measure, that they're trying to measure. So it's, even if people are telling the truth, I don't think that's solving the problem, except for maybe for really simple things like that are numerical. But the census stuff, the census stuff seems to be indicating that for numerical stuff, it's really bad. Like where you can measure it and where you survey it and then measure it, it's like, it's really, really bad. There's a lot of disagreement, like 90% underreporting on some stuff. So yeah, I don't think the honesty is all of it. I like the idea of kind of setting up situations where people can be honest. I don't think the Mechanical Turk or the Prolific kind of thing is a situation like that, because I think that's the usual online services that people are using for most surveys. I think they're trying to get their contribution accepted. They're trying to make their $2, and that's their first concern, rather than, you know, telling the truth or anything like that, or being, you know, emotionally accurate with that, with whatever it is. And people, the incentives matter. It's not that they don't, but I think honesty versus dishonesty is going to be overwhelmed by just different language use, different interpretations. Honesty is hard. Like it's hard to say what you mean. The more close to reality you try to be, the harder it is to express. And I think there are situations where it's like, wow, I'm surprised, you know, the survey did this good, but I still don't think it gives us much information. It's hard to know. You always have to dig into the questions, like what exact questions were answered or were they asking, and then you have to try to think about, well, how were people interpreting these, and we'll never know because it's generally anonymous. When people go back and ask people, you know, about their survey responses, they tend to get really surprising information that suggests that the accepted meaning of the survey was not what the survey takers had in mind. I think it's sort of like a second level survey as a criticism of a survey, but I think that's it's an informative technique. It's interesting.
So we probably have time for, there's one more question out there. We could do it.
I had a question that I think was related to what Allison was asking, or I think part of your answer about you know, how do you get interested in mountains, right? How do you get interested in phenomena? Where I think part of your answer was basically like, well, you take the same mountain and you watch it change over time, and that gives you more information about the logic of all of the individual bits of the I don't know, experience that that are changing, right? And then part of what you were saying about words with like Graham's question and stuff. I think basically about having this sort of continuing game of discovering more stuff about the situation. But I think it's interesting, specifically thinking about mountain views and stuff. because I have definitely had what Allison was describing, where it's basic. It's hard to say what the situations are going to be where you go and you look more at a scenario and you feel like there's more and more mystery and there's more and more ignorance, whereas in distinguishing that from scenarios where it's like, okay, maybe you're on like a road trip and you're just going through the mountains and like you stop at a scenic mountain view and then you stop at another scenic mountain view and then you stop at another and you're like, wow, this is another goddamn scenic mountain view. Great. Get back in the car. like I want a burger. You know, and like what I don't know if there's a general theory of this, right? But it seems like the same sort of approach of basically just, you know, just going into it over and over again can lead to like, you know, major interest or like extreme boredom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I've been knitting for over 30 years and I don't think just starting knitting is that interesting. Like it's okay, what's this? Like yeah, and I think it's also different if you climbed all the way up there, like it kind of feels like, oh, I earned this in some way, this is mine, this is my territory now. But yeah, just having more context gives you like a zone in which to be curious or something to be curious about, whereas just like, oh, this is a pretty mountain view, what are you curious about? Like you don't have any preconceptions or any context. So yeah, I could see it being hard to be interested. The more context and the more, almost like the less ignorance you have, the more ignorance you can get. Like, or I don't know if that's just ridiculous. I take that back. That's ridiculous. That doesn't even make sense. But yeah, I agree with Adam.
Amazing. Well, should we call it?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is so fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming, and please check out Snow White if you haven't already. If you came here via Sarah, then check it out. I think you might
cool art.
get some art. Yeah, and I don't know, there might be another one of these. Not sure. Awesome. DVD, so check back. And I really want to read that paper. Will you send it to me?
Sure. Do mountains exist? Yeah, I'll send it to you. It's great. Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right, everyone.
Okay. Thank you for coming. I'll see you later.
Take care.
I almost smoked my mic.